Before the year 2011, the largest living structure on this planet did not exist. Today it stretches 8,850 kilometres across the Atlantic, from West Africa to the Gulf of Mexico, and satellites track it every month. It is not a reef, and it is not a landmass. It is alive, it is growing, and last year it broke every record we have. 15 years after it appeared out of nothing, the people studying it have published 3 different explanations for what feeds it, and the newest one concludes that whatever started it is no longer what keeps it running. So what is actually floating out there, and why can nobody agree where it came from? If that is bothering you as much as it is bothering me, hit that like button and subscribe to the Skylab. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, and whether this stuff has ever washed up near you. Now let's get into it. Part 1. The thing that was never there before. There is a structure in the Atlantic Ocean right now that is roughly 8,850 kilometres long. That is about 5,500 miles. It begins off the coast of West Africa, and it ends in the Gulf of Mexico, and in between it crosses the entire tropical Atlantic without a meaningful break. If you could see it from a low orbit with your own eyes, it would look like someone had drawn a line across the ocean. It is not a reef, it is not a sandbar or a shoal or a chain of islands. It is not an oil slick, and it is not garbage, though a lot of people assume it must be. It is alive. The structure is made of seaweed. Specifically, it is made of a floating brown algae called sargassum, and by sheer biomass it is now the largest bloom of macroalgae that has ever been documented on this planet. Not the largest this decade, the largest ever recorded in the entire history of us looking, and here is the part that should stop you, because it stopped the people who found it. Before the year 2011, it did not exist. That is not a figure of speech, and it is not an exaggeration for effect. We have satellite coverage of the tropical Atlantic going back decades. Researchers went back through that archive looking for earlier versions of this thing, some faint precursor, some seasonal ghost of it in the 1990s or the 2000s. There is nothing. The record is clean. No belt through 2010. A belt from 2011 onward, every single year, growing. Almost everything we study about the ocean is older than our ability to study it. The Gulf Stream was moving before anyone knew what a current was. The Mariana Trench was there before we had a word for it. When oceanographers describe a large feature, they are almost always describing something that predates the instrument that found it, which means we are always arriving late to our own discoveries. Not this time. This time we were already watching. We had the cameras up and running and pointed at the right ocean, and we caught the entire thing forming from nothing, which in earth science is close to unheard of. So what actually is it? And where did it come from? And why is nobody able to agree on what feeds it? Researchers call it the Great Atlantic Sargassum Belt. In the literature you will see it abbreviated as the GASB, which is one of those acronyms that sounds like a noise a person makes when they see the thing for the first time. It was formally described and named in a paper published in the journal Science in 2019 by Meng-Q Wang, Chuanmin Hu, Brian Barnes, Gary Mitchum, Brian Lapointe and Joseph Montoya. Volume 365, pages 83 to 87. Short paper. Enormous subject. What that paper documented was the belt as it stood in 2018, a continuous band exceeding 8,850 kilometres in length, containing more than 20 million metric tons of living biomass. 20 million tons of seaweed floating. To give you a sense of that number, 20 million tons is roughly the mass of 200 fully loaded aircraft carriers. Except it is not steel, it is not concentrated in one place, and it is not sitting still. It is spread across an ocean, it is photosynthesizing, and it is growing. And 2018, it turns out, was a light year. By May of 2025, the satellite estimate for total sargassum across the entire Atlantic, including the Caribbean Sea and the Gulf of Mexico, had reached roughly 37.5 to 38 million metric tons. That was an all-time record in the satellite era, nearly double the figure that had earned a paper in Science 7 years earlier. Then 2026 arrived, and the numbers got stranger. In March of this year, projections put more than 9.3 million tons of sargassum already in transit toward Florida and the Caribbean, and coverage at the time started using a phrase that had not really been applied to seaweed before: the largest marine bioinvasion ever recorded. Not the largest bloom, the largest bio-invasion. That is the language of something arriving rather than something growing. By the end of May, the monthly bulletin out of the University of South Florida reported that every single tracked region except the West Atlantic had hit a record high for the month of May. 3 separate large masses were visible inside the belt. Transport into the Gulf was running at a record for that time of year, and in June, 2 individual records fell at once. The Western Caribbean reached 3.6 million metric tons, which is an all-time high for any month in the record. The Gulf of Mexico reached 5 million metric tons, which is also an all-time high, and which is very close to double the previous record set only the year before. Across the full belt, June of 2026 came in as the second highest month ever measured, sitting just behind June of 2025, which is to say the 2 largest months in the entire history of measuring this thing happened in the last 14 months, and we are still inside the season. The people who published those numbers wrote, in their own bulletin, that 2026 is set to be another major sargassum year, and possibly a record year by the summer. We are in the summer. It is worth knowing where those numbers actually come from, because the instrument is part of the story. They are produced by the Optical Oceanography Lab at the University of South Florida's College of Marine Science, through something called the Sargassum Watch System. The named contacts on this year's bulletins are Brian Barnes, Yu Yuan Ji, and Chuan Min Hu. Every month they publish a map, a set of regional tonnages, and a short forecast, and they publish it free, with a disclaimer at the top warning that the product should not be used commercially or to predict conditions at any specific beach. The detection works because sargassum has a reflectance signature. Living algae absorb and reflect light in a pattern that is distinguishable from open water when you look at the right wavelengths, and once you know what that pattern looks like, you can teach a satellite to count it. What comes back is not a photograph of seaweed. It is a statistical estimate of how much of each pixel of ocean is covered by something with the optical fingerprint of this specific organism, converted into tons. The regional breakdown in the May Bulletin gives you a feel for how the mass is distributed. The figures reported across the tracked sub-regions that month ran to 28.9 million tons, 13.8 million, 6.6 million, 5 million, 3.5 million, and 2.5 million. Different slices of ocean, different totals, all of them being tracked separately because the belt does not behave as one thing. It behaves as a chain of regions handing biomass westward to each other. We talked about instrument limits 2 days ago, in our video on the surface of the Sun, and what happens when the resolution finally catches up with the theory. The lesson there applies here in reverse. On the Sun, better instruments revealed structure that had always been present and had simply been blurred out. In the Atlantic, the instruments did not get dramatically better in 2011. The same class of satellites was watching before and after. The thing they detected genuinely was not there and then genuinely was. Now, I want to be careful here, because there is a mental image that forms when you hear numbers like this, and the image is wrong. When I say a structure 8,000 kilometres across, you are probably picturing a solid green mass, an unbroken carpet of weed you could walk on. It is not that. On the published abundance maps, the very top colour band, the reddest, densest, most alarming pixel on the whole map, represents about 0.4% of the ocean surface being covered by sargassum. 0.4%, 4 parts in 1,000. If you sailed straight through the worst of it, you would not be pushing through a wall of vegetation. You would be moving through open blue water with mats and clumps and long windrows of brown weeds scattered across it, sometimes stretching to the horizon in lines, sometimes just a raft here and a raft there. Individual aggregations do get genuinely large. Some of the coherent mats resolved from orbit measure about 1 kilometre across on their own. But the belt as a whole is a statistical structure. It is a region where the density of a floating organism is high enough that a satellite can pick it out from space, which, if you think about it for a second, is somehow more unsettling rather than less. We are not talking about a solid object. We're talking about something so diffuse that it covers less than 0.5% of the water, and it is still the biggest bloom ever recorded, still visible from orbit and still growing. There is one more thing about this belt that makes it genuinely strange, and it is the thing that turns a nature story into a mystery. 15 years after it appeared, the scientific community has not settled on what feeds it. That is not a case of nobody having looked. People have looked very hard. In the last 5 years alone, 3 major papers have been published in top-tier journals, proposing 3 substantially different explanations for what fuels this thing. One in 2021 said the nitrogen is coming off the land. One in 2025 said no, it is coming up from the ocean interior at the equator, and explicitly argued against the land explanation. And one published this year, in 2026, said something stranger than either of them, which is that the answer has changed over time, that the thing which started the belt is no longer the thing keeping it alive. That last idea is the spine of everything we're going to look at today, so hold on to it. The belt has changed masters. Whatever switched it on in 2011 has handed control to something else, and that handover is why 3 sets of very good scientists can look at the same ocean and come away with 3 different answers. Before we can understand any of that, though, we need to understand the organism itself. Because sargassum is not a normal seaweed, and almost everything odd about the belt traces back to one biological decision this thing made a very long time ago. Part 2. The weed that refused to sink. Nearly every seaweed you have ever seen in your life was attached to something. Kelp anchors to rock with a structure called a holdfast. The green stuff on a pier is fixed to the pier. The brown fronds waving in a tide pool are gripping the stone underneath them. That is the standard arrangement for macroalgae, and it has been the standard arrangement for a very long time because it solves an obvious problem. If you need sunlight and you live in the sea, you had better not drift somewhere that lacks it. Sargassum in the open Atlantic does not do this. 2 species in particular, Sargassum natans and Sargassum fluitans, never attach to anything at any point in their entire lives. There is no juvenile stage where they cling to a rock and then let go. There is no seasonal anchoring. They are born adrift, they grow adrift, they fragment adrift, and they die adrift. Biologists have a word for that. They call it holopelagic, which means fully of the open water. It is a rare lifestyle for a large alga, and it is the single most important fact about this organism, because it is the reason a seaweed can form a structure the size of an ocean basin in the first place. A seaweed bolted to the seafloor is limited by the seafloor. A seaweed that floats is limited by nothing except the currents and the food supply. The floating is not passive either. It is engineered. If you pull a handful of pelagic sargassum out of the water, the first thing you notice is that it is studded with small round bladders, each one a few millimeters across, clustered along the stems like miniature grapes. Those are pneumatocysts. They are gas-filled. They exist for exactly one purpose, which is to keep the organism at the surface where the light is, and they do it well enough that a mat of this stuff will sit at the waterline indefinitely, riding swell after swell, going wherever the wind and the current take it. That is the whole strategy. Stay up, stay in the light, let the ocean handle transportation. It is also a strategy with a hard failure mode, which is worth noting now because it comes back later. A pneumatocyst is a gas bladder, and gas bladders can be damaged, colonized, fouled, or simply worn out. When enough of them fail on a given piece of the organism, that piece loses buoyancy and sinks, and once it drops below the sunlit layer it is finished. There is no mechanism for a photosynthetic organism to come back up. So every individual piece of this seaweed is in a slow race between growing and sinking, and the entire population is a balance between the rate at which new floating tissue is produced and the rate at which old tissue drops out of the light. Change either side of that balance and the size of the whole structure changes with it. The 2 species are also not quite interchangeable, and researchers distinguish between them and between their forms when they sample, because they differ in morphology, in how the blades are shaped, in the arrangement of the bladders, in how the branches sit. Those differences matter for how the material behaves in the water, how it clumps, how it fouls, and how it decomposes when it strands. The composition of a bloom is not just how much there is, it is what mix of forms it is made of, and it works in the sense that this arrangement has been running successfully in the Atlantic for a very long time. We will get to how long in a moment, and the number is going to surprise you. The reproduction is worth pausing on too because it explains how the belt can appear so quickly once conditions turn favourable. Pelagic sargassum reproduces mainly by fragmentation. A piece breaks off a mat. in a swell, in a storm, under the weight of an animal, or just from ordinary wear, and that piece is now a new individual. It does not need to find a mate. It does not need to settle anywhere. It just keeps growing. Which means the growth of the population is not limited by a reproductive bottleneck the way it is for most large organisms. Give it nutrients and light and the right temperature, and it does not have to wait for a breeding season. It just gets bigger and breaks apart and gets bigger again, and every break makes two of what there was one of before. Under favourable conditions, this system can double its biomass in about 11 days. Sit with that for a second, because it is the number that makes the belt possible. 11 days, not 11 months. If you start with 1,000 tons and give it a good enough environment, in 11 days you have 2,000. 11 days after that, 4,000. 11 days after that, 8. It is the classic exponential shape, and it means that a population that is invisible in January can be a satellite feature by April, provided the food holds out. The food is the catch, and the food is the whole story, and we will come back to it hard. To understand why the food is the constraint rather than the light or the temperature, you have to know what the open tropical Atlantic is actually like as a place to live. The word oceanographers use for it is oligotrophic, which translates roughly as poorly fed. The surface water in the middle of an ocean basin is for most of the year close to a nutritional desert. The sunlight is abundant and the water is warm and the space is unlimited, and almost nothing grows there, because the two nutrients that every photosynthetic organism needs in quantity, nitrogen and phosphorus, are largely absent from the sunlit layer. They are not absent from the ocean. They are just in the wrong place. Nitrogen and phosphorus accumulate in the water far below the surface, hundreds of meters down, because that is where organic material sinks to and decays. The sunlit layer is where the light is. The nutrients are where the light is not. The entire productivity of the open ocean comes down to how much of that lower water gets lifted into the upper water, and by what. That is why the open Atlantic historically capped sargassum's growth. The organism had all the light it could use and effectively no food. It was not held back by its biology. It was held back by an empty pantry. Which sets up the question the rest of this video is built around. If the pantry was empty for 30 million years, what filled it in 2011? The organism's physical tolerances have been mapped fairly carefully, and they matter, because they tell you where this thing can and cannot go. Laboratory culture work going back to 1987 put the optimal temperature range for these two species between 18 and 30 degrees Celsius, which is about 64 to 86 degrees Fahrenheit. That is a wide window. It comfortably covers the tropical Atlantic and it comfortably covers the subtropical Atlantic, which means temperature alone does not draw a hard boundary around where the belt can exist. Salinity is narrower and more interesting. In the lab, these species grow best somewhere between 36 and 42 practical salinity units, and growth drops off below 30. But field surveys found something that does not match the lab result cleanly. Out in the actual ocean, biomass was distributed fairly evenly across the range of 32 to 36, and, here is the odd part, abundance was actually higher in the slightly fresher band, from 32.4 to 33.5, than it was in the saltier band above that. That should not happen if salinity is the controlling variable. So why does it? Because fresher water in the tropical Atlantic means river water, and river water carries food. The seaweed is not growing better because the water is less salty. It is growing better because the thing making the water less salty is also delivering nitrogen and phosphorus. The salinity signal is a fingerprint of a nutrient plume, and the organism is tracking the food, not the salt. Hold on to that, because it is one of the first threads in the argument about what feeds the belt, and it points at the land. There is one more line of evidence about the organism itself that I want to put on the table now, because it eliminates the explanation that most people reach for instinctively. If you tell someone that a giant tropical algae bloom appeared in 2011 and has been growing ever since, their first assumption is usually that the ocean got warmer and the seaweed liked it. That is a completely reasonable assumption. It is also, as far as the direct measurements go, wrong. A study published in 2023 in the journal Aquatic Botany by Magaña Gallegos and colleagues took different genotypes of pelagic sargassum and measured how fast they grew at different temperatures across their natural range. If warming were the driver, you would expect growth to climb sharply as you move toward the warm end of the range. That is not what they found. They found similarly high growth rates across the entire temperature range they tested. The conclusion drawn from that result was direct. It negated the hypothesis that sea surface temperature warming between 2010 and 2020 was the primary driver of the belt. The organism was not sitting there waiting for the water to hit some threshold. It grows about as well at the cool end of its range as at the warm end. So temperature is not the lever. Something else pulled it. This matters enormously for the central question, because it removes the easy answer and forces us toward the harder ones. The belt is not simply a thermometer with fronds. Whatever changed in 2011 changed the food supply or changed the geography, not the heat. And to understand why the geography mattering is such a big deal, you have to know where this organism used to live. Because it did have a home. For as long as anyone has been writing things down, Sargassum lived in one specific part of the Atlantic, a place with no coastline, no ports, no shores at all, and a 500-year reputation for eating ships. Part 3. The Sea with No Shores. Every sea on Earth is defined by land. The Mediterranean has Europe on one side and Africa on the other. The Caribbean has the Antilles wrapped around it. The Red Sea, the North Sea, the Coral Sea, the Bering Sea, all of them are bounded somewhere by something you could stand on. There is exactly one exception, and it is in the middle of the North Atlantic. The Sargasso Sea has no land boundary anywhere, not 1 metre of coast. It is roughly 2 million square miles of ocean sitting inside the North Atlantic, and what defines its edges is not geology, it is motion. On the western side, the Gulf Stream. On the northern side, the North Atlantic Current. On the eastern side, the Canary Current. On the southern side, the North Atlantic Equatorial Current. 4 rivers of moving water, arranged in a rough rectangle, each one flowing into the next, forming an enormous, slow, clockwise rotation known as the North Atlantic Subtropical Gyre. That rotation is the boundary. Inside it, the water is calmer, warmer, saltier and clearer than the water outside it. The Sargasso is famous among sailors for the blueness of the water and the distance you can see down into it. That clarity is not a virtue, incidentally. Water is clear when there is nothing suspended in it, and in the ocean the things suspended in water are mostly alive. The famous blue of the Sargasso Sea is the blue of a place where very little is growing. Sailors described it as beautiful. A marine biologist would describe it as a desert with excellent visibility. The trapping property has a modern consequence too, and it is one most people have heard of without connecting it to this. The same convergence that gathered seaweed into the centre of this gyre for millions of years also gathers everything else that floats. The North Atlantic garbage patch, the accumulation of plastic debris in the middle of this ocean, sits in the same rotating system, for the same physical reason. The gyre does not distinguish between a frond of algae and a fragment of a bottle. It collects buoyant things. It has been collecting seaweed since before there were primates, and it started collecting plastic about 70 years ago, and both are still there. And crucially, a rotating system like that acts as a trap for anything that floats. Buoyant material drifts inward and tends to stay. Once you're in the gyre keeps you. Which is why, for as long as human beings have crossed this ocean, that is where the seaweed was. 15th century Portuguese navigators working the mid-Atlantic came across mats of the stuff floating in enormous quantities, and named the region for what they were seeing from the Portuguese word sargacho, the name stuck. The sea is named after the weed, which is a slightly unusual thing to be able to say about a body of water. And then there is Columbus. In 1492, crossing westward, his crews sailed into the weed and reacted the way you might expect people to react when the water they are floating on starts filling up with vegetation, and they have no idea how far land is in any direction. The accounts describe genuine fear that the ships would become entangled and would never get out. That fear was not correct. We will come back to why in a moment, but it was real, and it was recorded, and it planted something in the maritime imagination that never quite went away. For centuries afterwards, this region carried a reputation for swallowing vessels. The geography of that reputation overlaps, not coincidentally, with a region that a much later generation would rebrand as the Bermuda Triangle. The mechanical claim, though, does not survive contact with the actual seaweed. Pelagic sargassum mats are discontinuous surface rafts, generally thin, and they part around a hull the way a leaf layer parts around your hand. There is no version of this material that stops a ship. What there is a 500-year-old story about a sea that behaves like nothing else on the map, and stories like that tend to outlive their evidence by a wide margin. So that was the arrangement. One organism, one gyre, one home, and a long history of people finding it eerie. What almost nobody outside marine biology appreciates is how old that arrangement is. The fossil record for pelagic sargassum communities in broadly this region of the Atlantic runs back roughly 30 million years. 30 million. To put that in the only scale that really lands, the Isthmus of Panama did not exist yet. The Atlantic and the Pacific were still connected. There were no polar ice caps in the north. The animals in these mats were floating around a planet whose continents were arranged differently from the one you live on. And in all that time, this thing stayed where it was. That is the control condition. That is the baseline you have to hold in your head to understand why 2011 is such a violent departure. This is not an organism with a history of expansion. This is an organism that found a trap in the ocean, settled into it, and stayed put through the entire Miocene, the Pliocene, the Pleistocene, and every ice age we have records of. Then, inside one human decade, it colonized a different ocean basin. The other thing 30 million years buys you is passengers. A habitat that's stable for that long does not stay empty, and the Sargasso Sea's mats are not just weed. They are a functioning ecosystem with residents that exist nowhere else on Earth. Roughly 100 species of fish and around 145 species of invertebrates are associated with these floating mats. Some of them use the weed opportunistically, others cannot live without it. The emblem of the whole system is a fish called histrio, commonly known as the sargassum fish. It is a frog fish, and it is one of the more remarkable examples of camouflage in the ocean. Its body is mottled brown and yellow in exactly the tones of the weed. It has grown fleshy dermal appendages, flaps and tabs of skin, that mimic the shape of the fronds and the bladders. Put one in a sargassum mat and it disappears, not approximately but completely. It is also, in a sense, trapped by its own success. The sargassum fish is a poor swimmer in open water. It moves through the weed by grasping and clambering with modified fins rather than by swimming, and away from the mats it is slow, conspicuous and vulnerable. It did not just adapt to this habitat, it committed to it. There is a second passenger story here that is even harder to believe, and it involves an animal that does not live in the Sargasso Sea at all for most of its life. European eels and American eels spend their adult years in freshwater rivers on two different continents, thousands of miles apart, and when the time comes to breed, both of them leave. They swim downstream, out of the rivers, into the ocean, and they cross the Atlantic to spawn in the Sargasso Sea. Their larvae then drift back on the currents to the rivers their parents came from, a journey that can take years. For a long time, nobody could work out where eels came from, because nobody ever found a young one in a river. Aristotle concluded they emerged spontaneously from mud, which, given the information he had, was not an unreasonable guess. The answer turned out to be that the nursery was in the middle of an ocean, inside a sea with no shores, and the animals were commuting to it from two continents. That is the kind of thing the Sargasso Sea is. It is not a blank patch in the middle of the Atlantic. It is a destination. The mats are also a nursery in the more literal sense, and that word is doing real work. Juvenile sea turtles of several species spend years of early life in sargassum rafts, hiding in the weed during the phase of their lives when they are small enough to be eaten by almost everything. Commercially important fish, including dolphinfish and jacks, use the mats for foraging and shelter. If you removed pelagic sargassum from the Atlantic, you would not be removing a nuisance. You would be removing a floating forest that a large number of species built their strategies around. Which brings us to the uncomfortable shape of this entire story, and the reason the central thread matters so much. This organism is not an invader. It is not a pollutant. It is not new. It is not foreign. And it is not a mistake. It has been an essential and stable part of this ocean since before the modern continents locked into place. Every headline you will read about it being harmful is describing the same species that has been running a 30-million-year nursery a few hundred miles east of Bermuda. Nothing about the organism changed. What changed was where it is, how much of it there is, and what is feeding it. And that change happened in a single spring, in a place the seaweed had no business being, roughly 3,000 miles from the only home it had ever had. Part 4. Spring 2011. The first sign that something had changed did not arrive as a satellite image or a research paper. It arrived on a beach. In the spring of 2011, sargassum began washing ashore across the Caribbean in quantities that nobody working in the region had ever dealt with. not a heavier than usual weed line. Thousands of tons, piling up on beaches that normally got a scattering, arriving day after day in places that had no equipment and no procedure for removing it because they had never needed either. Small amounts of this seaweed had always shown up on Caribbean shores. It drifts, it strands. That is what floating things do. But the scale in 2011 was a different category of event, and the people dealing with it recognized that immediately, because you cannot mistake a few tons for a few thousand when it is sitting on your beach and rotting. It is worth being concrete about what a stranding of that size actually does to a place, because the abstraction hides the problem. A beach receiving a heavy sargassum event does not get a tide line of weed, it gets a bank. In the worst events, the material comes ashore in a layer that can reach a metre thick and extend the length of the beach and out into the shallows, and it keeps arriving while you are trying to remove what came yesterday. Removal is not simple either. You cannot leave it, because of what it does when it decomposes, and we are going to get to that in some detail later. But you also cannot simply scrape it up with heavy machinery without taking the beach with it. The weed comes ashore mixed with sand, and a mechanical clearance operation can strip an enormous volume of sand off a shoreline along with the algae, which then has to be replaced. Islands that depend on their beaches economically found themselves choosing between a rotting shoreline and an eroding one. And none of these places had a plan, because until that spring there had been no reason to have one. The first question everyone asked was the obvious one. The Sargasso Sea must be overflowing. Something must have knocked material loose from the gyre and pushed it south and west into the islands. That is not what happened. When researchers went to the satellite record to trace the material back to its source, the answer that came out was not the Sargasso Sea. The imagery showed a new population of sargassum forming in the equatorial Atlantic, a completely different part of the ocean, thousands of kilometres south of the gyre, and the origin point sat north of the mouth of the Amazon River. That is a genuinely strange result, and I want to make sure the strangeness lands. The seaweed had lived in one region for 30 million years. It suddenly appeared, in bloom quantities, in a region where it had no established population, at latitudes where it had never been a significant presence, not as an overflow from the old range, as a new range. The Amazon is not an incidental detail in that sentence either. It is the largest river on Earth by discharge, by an enormous margin. It delivers more fresh water to the ocean than the next several largest rivers combined. That water does not simply mix in at the coastline. It forms a plume, a body of comparatively fresh, sediment-loaded, nutrient-carrying water that spreads out across the shelf and then gets carried northwest along the South American coast for hundreds of kilometres before it is fully absorbed into the surrounding ocean. If you were designing a place to grow a nutrient-limited floating plant in an otherwise barren tropical ocean, you would put it exactly there. Downstream of the largest freshwater and nutrient delivery system on the planet, in a warm, sunlit surface layer, on a current that recirculates. And it did not fade out the following year, it came back. The way that reconstruction was done is worth understanding, because it is the reason we can be confident about the 2011 boundary, rather than merely suspicious. Satellites carrying instruments capable of detecting this kind of surface algae have been flying and archiving continuously since around the turn of the century. That archive does not get thrown away. It sits there, a daily record of what the surface of the ocean looked like, waiting for somebody to ask it a question nobody thought to ask at the time. So when the strandings began, researchers went back and reinterrogated years of imagery that had already been collected for entirely different purposes. They ran the detection method backwards through the archive year by year, looking for the belt's optical signature in the tropical Atlantic before anyone knew to look for it. The answer came back essentially empty. Sargassum was detectable in the Sargasso Sea, where it was supposed to be. In the equatorial corridor through the 2000s, there was nothing that resembled the structure that appeared in 2011. That is about as clean a before and after as environmental science ever gets. It is not an inference from proxies. It is not a reconstruction from sediment cores, or tree rings, or ice layers. It is the same instrument, looking at the same water with the same method, returning nothing and then returning a continent-sized feature. By the middle of the decade, the material was organizing into something coherent, not a patch, not a plume, but a seasonal band forming reliably every year, running east to west across the tropical Atlantic, filling in the corridor between Africa and South America, and then extending into the Caribbean and eventually the Gulf. That band is what got formally described and named in 2019. The recurrence is the part that changed the interpretation from event to phenomenon. A single bad year is an anomaly, and anomalies happen. 2 bad years is a coincidence. 15 consecutive years, arriving on a schedule, growing on a trend, is a new feature of the ocean, and the institutional response tracked that realization slowly. For the first several years, the strandings were handled as disasters, emergency clearance, emergency funding, the assumption that next year would be normal. It took most of a decade before the framing shifted to the one that is now standard, which treats this as a seasonal, recurring, forecastable hazard requiring permanent infrastructure rather than repeated emergency response. That shift in framing is the same one that eventually happens with every new recurring hazard, and it always happens later than it should. The seasonality is tight enough to set your calendar by. The belt builds through the first months of the year, peaks somewhere between April and July depending on the year and the region, then declines through the autumn, then does it again. Every year. It is not a one-off bloom event that is taking a long time to clear. It is a recurring annual structure with a growth season, like a forest that leafs out and drops. That regularity is itself evidence. Random events do not repeat on a schedule. A system that reforms every single year in the same corridor with the same seasonal shape is a system with a mechanism behind it, and finding that mechanism became the central problem of an entire subfield. The first serious attempt to describe how the population had established itself came from Elizabeth Johns and colleagues, published in the journal Progress in Oceanography, volume 182 in 2020. The title tells you the argument: the establishment of a pelagic sargassum population in the tropical Atlantic, described as the biological consequence of a basin-scale, long-distance dispersal event. Read that phrase again, because it is doing a lot of work. A dispersal event, not a bloom event. The claim is that the fundamental thing that happened was a relocation, that a population of organisms got moved, at ocean basin scale, from where it lived to somewhere else, and then found conditions in the new place that let it do something it could never do in the old one. That team also mapped where the biomass actually concentrates once it is there. The highest density sits in the central tropical Atlantic between 5 and 10 degrees north latitude and between 15 and 48 degrees west longitude. That band is tied to the equatorial current systems and to the intertropical convergence zone, the belt of converging trade winds that circles the planet near the equator and drives most of the tropical weather you have ever heard of. That density core is worth holding on to because of where it sits. 5 to 10 degrees north is not the equator, and it is not the subtropics. It is the corridor between them, and it is the corridor the intertropical convergence zone occupies for much of the year. If you have ever wondered why the tropical rain bands on a global weather map sit in a stripe rather than a ring around the equator itself, that is the convergence zone, and it migrates north and south with the seasons as the sun's heating shifts. The belt lives in that stripe, which means the belt's position is not an accident of where the seaweed happened to end up. It is pinned to one of the largest organized features in the planet's atmosphere, so we have a location, a season, and a shape. What we do not yet have is a cause, and the cause is where this gets genuinely contested. It is also worth saying plainly how young this whole field is. The belt was first noticed in 2011, first formally described in 2019, and the papers arguing about its cause were published in 2021, 2025 and 2026. There is no textbook chapter on this. There is no settled model that everyone learned in graduate school. Every researcher working on it is working on something that appeared inside their own career, which is exhilarating if you are a scientist and deeply inconvenient if you are a government trying to decide what to budget for. But before the argument about food, there is a question about transport, and it turns out the transport question has a much cleaner answer. Something had to move the seaweed out of a gyre that had held it for 30 million years, and that something left a signature in the atmospheric record that you can go and look at. It was not a current. It was the wind. Part 5. The wind that moved. An ocean. There is a number that atmospheric scientists watch called the North Atlantic Oscillation. If you follow weather at all, you have probably heard it mentioned in passing, and then immediately forgotten it, because it sounds like bookkeeping. It is not. It is one of the most consequential patterns in the Northern Hemisphere, and in this story it is the trigger. The North Atlantic Oscillation is, at its simplest, the pressure difference between two semi-permanent features of the Atlantic atmosphere. a low-pressure region near Iceland and a high-pressure region near the Azores. When that pressure gap is large, the oscillation is in a positive phase. The westerly winds across the Atlantic are strong and take a northerly track, and the storm track runs high. When the gap collapses, the oscillation goes negative, the westerlies weaken and shift south, and the whole circulation of the North Atlantic reorganizes itself. Everything downstream of those winds responds. Winter temperatures in Europe, storm tracks into Britain, sea ice in the Labrador Sea, and as it turns out, the position of floating objects in the middle of the ocean. Around 2009 and 2010, the North Atlantic oscillation went into an unusually strong and unusually prolonged negative phase. That is the moment. That is the atmospheric fingerprint on the whole event. You may remember the surface consequences without knowing what caused them. That was the winter the eastern United States got buried repeatedly. The winter Britain and northern Europe went through an extended freeze that shut down airports and transport. The winter that produced a run of headlines about snow in places that do not normally get much of it. All of that is downstream of the same reorganization, a weakened, southward displaced westerly flow, letting cold air spill into places the storm track normally protects. Almost nobody at the time connected any of that to seaweed. Why would they? The atmospheric anomaly was being discussed as a weather story on land, and the thing it was quietly doing to a floating organism in the middle of the ocean would not become visible for another 18 months, and would not be explained for another 16 years. The mechanism by which a wind field holds floating material inside a gyre is worth a moment, because it is not intuitive. Wind blowing across the ocean surface does not push the water straight downwind. The rotation of the planet deflects the resulting flow, and the net transport of the surface layer ends up running at an angle to the wind rather than along it. In a subtropical gyre, that angled transport points inward from all sides, which piles water, and everything floating on it, toward the middle. The centre of the gyre is, in a real physical sense, slightly uphill. It is a very shallow bowl of water held up by wind. Change the wind field for long enough and the bowl relaxes. The convergence weakens. Material that had been held near the centre begins to leak toward the edges, and the currents at the edges take it somewhere else. That is what happened to the seaweed. The wind patterns that resulted were anomalous enough to do something the ordinary circulation does not do, which is to push floating material out of the North Atlantic subtropical gyre. Remember the geometry from earlier, and the gyre is a trap because it rotates, and rotation gathers buoyant material inward. Break the wind field that helps maintain that rotation, distort the surface drift for long enough, and the trap leaks. Material that had been circulating in the Sargasso Sea got carried out of it, east and south, toward the coast of West Africa and down into the equatorial Atlantic. And that is where the story turns, because the equatorial Atlantic is not the Sargasso Sea. It is a different world with a different budget. The Sargasso is famous for the clarity of its water, and clarity in the ocean is a polite way of saying there is nothing in it. It is one of the most nutrient-poor surface environments on the planet. The seaweed living there was existing at the edge of what its food supply could sustain, which is exactly why the population had stayed roughly the same size for geological spans of time. The equatorial Atlantic has food. It has upwelling. It has enormous river plumes arriving from South America and Africa. It has trade wind convergence that piles material together, and mixing that lifts nutrients from below. It is warmer, and while temperature is not the driver, it does not hurt. Upwelling is the piece most people have heard of, and fewest people can actually describe, so let me do it properly because it becomes central later. The ocean is layered. Warm, light water sits on top. Cold, heavy water sits underneath. And the boundary between them resists mixing, the way oil resists mixing with water. Almost all the nutrients are in the lower layer, because that is where sinking organic matter goes to decompose. The upper layer has the light and none of the food. The lower layer has the food and none of the light. Under normal conditions, the two barely talk to each other. Upwelling is the process that breaks that separation, where wind pushes surface water away from a place, along a coastline, or along the equator where the deflection from the planet's rotation works in opposite directions on either side. Water has to come up from below to replace what left, and the water that comes up is the water carrying the nutrients. Every one of the great fisheries on Earth sits on top of an upwelling zone: Peru, Namibia, California, Northwest Africa. Where the ocean turns itself over, life follows, and where it does not, you get the blue emptiness of a subtropical gyre. The equator has one of the most persistent upwelling systems on the planet running along it, and the seaweed had just been delivered into its northern margin. Take an organism that has been nutrient-starved for 30 million years and drop it into a nutrient-loaded ocean, and it does exactly what an organism with an 11-day doubling time does when the constraint is removed. It goes off. That is the sequence, and it is worth stating cleanly because it is the sentence the whole first half of this story builds to. The Great Atlantic Sargassum Belt did not begin because the ocean got hotter, and it did not begin because we dumped something into it in 2011. It began because a multi-year wind anomaly took a starving organism out of the pantryless room it had been locked in and put it somewhere with food. That is a dispersal accident. It is closer to an ecological accident than to a pollution event, at least in its origin. Now, I need to be honest about something here, because the temptation with a story like this is to declare the mystery solved and move on. The dispersal explanation is well supported and it is the trigger, but a trigger is not a fuel supply. Something moved the seaweed. That does not tell you what has been feeding it every year since, and it does not explain why the belt has kept getting larger for 15 consecutive years, while the atmospheric pattern that started it came and went and came back again. The North Atlantic Oscillation has been positive since then. It has been negative since then. It has done what it always does, which is oscillate. The belt has not followed it. That is a genuinely important piece of negative evidence, and it is easy to skate past. If the oscillation were the ongoing driver, the belt's annual size should correlate with the oscillations phase. Strong negative years should be big years. Strong positive years should be small ones. That relationship does not hold. The belt has grown through years when the atmospheric pattern was doing the opposite of what it was doing when the belt began, which is the single clearest indication that something took over. So the trigger cannot be the engine. That gap between what started the thing and what sustains it is the single most interesting scientific problem in this entire subject, and it is where the disagreement lives. There is a useful way to think about the distinction, and it comes up constantly in systems that undergo abrupt change. Imagine a heavy door held shut by a latch. You can push on that door all day and nothing happens. Lift the latch for 1 second and the door swings, and once it has swung, putting the latch back does not close it. The latch is the trigger. Gravity and the hinge are the engine. Anybody investigating why the door is open by studying the latch is going to be confused, because the latch has not been touched in years and the door is still open. The North Atlantic Oscillation lifted the latch in 2009 and 2010. The door swung in 2011. And every year since, people have been standing in the doorway measuring the latch. What we're going to do for the rest of this video is look at the hinge. It is also worth pausing to note what the trigger explanation does to the way you think about planetary change. We tend to imagine large-scale ecological shifts as slow, as the accumulated result of pressure applied over decades until something gives. Sometimes it works that way. But this case suggests a different mode entirely. A system sits in one stable configuration for tens of millions of years. A transient anomaly lasting a couple of seasons nudges it, and it lands in a completely different stable configuration and stays there. Nothing had to be permanently changed for the change to become permanent. The push was temporary, the result was not. We looked at a version of this pattern 3 days ago, in our video on the things going wrong beneath our feet. A planet where the shield, the core and the spin are all doing something slightly unexpected, and the changes are only visible because the instruments finally got good enough to see them. This is the same shape of problem seen from the opposite side. That story was about slow change we could not see. This one is about fast change we watched happen and still cannot explain. There is one more piece of the physical picture we need before we can approach the food question properly, and it explains why the belt is a belt rather than a blob. Because once the seaweed arrived in the equatorial Atlantic, something had to keep it there. Part 6. The conveyor. An object floating in the open ocean does not stay anywhere. That is the default condition. Currents move it, wind moves it, and over a period of months an unanchored thing in the Atlantic will generally end up somewhere entirely unlike where it started. So the fact that a floating organism has held a coherent position in the tropical Atlantic for 15 consecutive years demands an explanation. Something is holding it in place, and that something is a circulation loop. Oceanographers call it the North Equatorial Recirculation Region. In the papers it gets shortened to the NERR, and it functions as a conveyor belt with the ends joined together. Here is how the loop runs. The trade winds blow westward across the tropical Atlantic, and they drag the surface water westward with them. That water, carrying whatever is floating on it, runs into the coast of South America and turns northwest, joining the North Brazil Current, which runs up the shoulder of the continent toward the Caribbean. Then, at a point off the northeastern corner of South America, a large part of that flow does something unexpected. It turns back. This feature is called the North Brazil Current retroflexion, and it bends the water around and sends it east again into the North Equatorial Countercurrent, which carries it back across the Atlantic toward Africa. West on the trade winds, north along Brazil, east on the countercurrent, and then west again. That is a closed circuit, and anything that floats and does not sink or strand will keep going around it. Drifting buoy experiments described by Franks, Johnson and Co. in 2016 mapped exactly where material accumulates on that circuit, and they found two consolidation zones, one in the eastern part of the loop, taking in the Gulf of Guinea off West Africa, one in the western part at the North Brazil Current retroflexion. Two pools connected by two currents running in opposite directions with material sloshing between them on a seasonal rhythm. That is the belt. That is why it is shaped like a belt. It is a conveyor with two collection points, and the seaweed lives on the conveyor. The intertropical convergence zone sits over the top of this and adds a second effect. Where the trade winds of the two hemispheres meet, the air converges and rises, and the surface water beneath the convergence zone gets pushed together as well. Convergence concentrates floating material into lines and windrows. It is the same physics that gathers foam into streaks on a lake, scaled up to an ocean, and it is one reason the mats form the long linear structures that show up so clearly from orbit. Now, here is the detail that changes how you should think about all of this. The connections from this loop back to the subtropical North Atlantic, back to the Sargasso Sea, the original home, are weak and intermittent. There is a coastal current along West Africa that occasionally feeds material in from the north, and that is about it. The belt does not meaningfully drain back into the gyre it came from, which means the belt is not an extension of the Sargasso Sea. It is not the old population spilling over its edges. It is a separate, self-maintaining population living in a separate circulation system on a separate schedule, and the two are effectively isolated from one another. There are now two pelagic sargassum populations in the Atlantic Ocean. There used to be one. That is a sentence that deserves more attention than it usually gets. In 15 years, without anybody planning it or intending it or even noticing until after the fact, an ocean basin acquired a second population of a major habitat-forming organism in a location that population had never held, running on its own circulation, on its own schedule, effectively isolated from the original. Ecologists have language for a species arriving somewhere new. They call it a range expansion, or a colonization, or if humans moved it deliberately or accidentally, an introduction. None of those words fit cleanly here, because nobody moved it and it did not creep outward from its old range. It was relocated by the atmosphere, in bulk, in a couple of seasons, and then it established. The isolation has a longer-term implication that nobody can evaluate yet. Two populations of the same organism, living in two circulation systems that barely exchange material, in two quite different nutrient environments, reproducing by fragmentation rather than by mixing genes with each other, that is the standard setup for divergence. Given enough time, populations under those conditions stop being the same thing. Nobody is suggesting a new species has appeared in 15 years. That is not how this works. But the conditions that produce divergence are now in place in the Atlantic where they were not in place before, and the clock has started. There is also the question of what happens to the material that does not stay on the conveyor and does not strand. Some fraction of the biomass simply dies at sea, loses its buoyancy, and sinks. Where it goes after that, how far down it gets, how much of the carbon and nutrient load it takes with it, and how much is intercepted and recycled on the way, those are open questions with real consequences, and they turn out to matter enormously for the argument we're about to walk into. The rings deserve a mention too, because they are one of the more remarkable pieces of machinery in this ocean. When the North Brazil Current retroflects, it does not always turn smoothly. Sometimes a loop of it pinches off entirely, and becomes a freestanding rotating eddy, a coherent spinning body of water that separates from the current and travels northwest on its own, carrying its contents with it. These structures can be very large and can persist for months, and they are one of the primary vehicles by which material from the equatorial Atlantic ends up in the Caribbean. So when sargassum arrives on a beach in the Lesser Antilles, there is a reasonable chance it did not simply drift there. It was delivered by a rotating parcel of ocean that broke off South America and carried it across. The escape routes matter too because they are how the belt reaches people. Material leaves the loop and enters the Caribbean seasonally. In spring and summer it escapes through the North Brazil Current and the Guiana Current, and through the rings that spin off the retroflexion, enormous rotating eddies that pinch off from the current and drift northwest, carrying their contents with them. In winter, the escape route is the North Equatorial Current instead. So the beach strandings are not random. They are the output of a conveyor that leaks on a schedule, and the leak rate depends on how much material is on the conveyor in the first place. This is exactly why the March figure from earlier this year was reported the way it was. More than 9.3 million tonnes already in transit toward Florida and the Caribbean in March is not a forecast of growth. It is an inventory of material that has already left the loop and is on its way. The people producing those numbers were not predicting a bloom. They were counting something that had already departed and calculating when it would arrive. That is a fundamentally different kind of warning, and it is the reason these bulletins have become genuinely useful to the places on the receiving end. A hurricane forecast gives you days. A sargassum forecast can give you months, because the delivery mechanism is a slow current rather than a fast storm, and because the cargo is already visible from orbit the entire way. The seasonal migration of the convergence zone adds one more layer to the timing. That band of converging trade winds does not sit still through the year. It moves north through the northern summer and south through the northern winter, following the sun. The belt moves with it, and the escape routes into the Caribbean open and close according to where the currents and the wind band are sitting in any given month. So the annual rhythm you see in the numbers, the build through spring, and the peak around early summer and the decline through autumn, is not the seaweed having a growing season the way a forest does. It is an entire ocean atmosphere system breathing in and out, and the biomass is riding on the breath. That is the physical system in full. A dispersal event moved the organism. A recirculating loop holds it. A convergence zone concentrates it. Seasonal leakage delivers it to the islands and to Florida. Every part of that is reasonably well understood, and none of it answers the actual question, because a conveyor does not feed anything. The loop explains where the seaweed is. It does not explain how 38 million tons of living tissue gets built every year in an ocean that is supposed to be a nutritional desert. Something is delivering nitrogen and phosphorus into this system at industrial scale, and for the last 5 years the best marine scientists working on this problem have been publishing directly contradictory answers about what that something is. The first answer pointed at us. Part 7. The chemistry changed. In May of 2021, a team led by Brian LaPointe at Florida Atlantic University's Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institute published a paper in Nature Communications that did something clever. Instead of trying to measure the nutrients in an entire ocean, which is close to impossible, they measured the nutrients inside the seaweed. The logic is straightforward once you hear it. An organism is built out of whatever it eats. If the food supply changes, the organism's own tissue chemistry changes with it, and it keeps a record. You do not have to catch the nutrients moving through the water, you just have to ask the algae what it has been eating. The paper is Volume 12, Article 3060, and the co-author list runs through Rachel Bruton, Laura Heron, Mengqiu Wang, Chuanmin Hu, Dennis McGillicuddy Jr., Scott Lindell, Frank Hernandez, and Peter Morton. Some of those names you will recognize from the 2019 science paper that named the belt in the first place. This is a small field, and the same people keep showing up in it. What they assembled was a comparison across time, and the reason it works is a piece of scientific luck. Sargassum tissue had been collected and analysed in the 1980s for entirely unrelated reasons, and those samples and their measurements still existed. So the team put together a dataset spanning 2 eras, samples from 1983 to 1989 and samples from 2010 to 2019, 488 tissue samples in total. The sampling geography matters as much as the chronology. They took material from the Florida Keys, from the Gulf Stream off Miami, off Charleston and off Cape Fear, from Belize, and from oceanic stations in the northern, central and southern parts of the Sargasso Sea. Coastal water, current water, open ocean. If the chemistry were changing because of something local, the geographic spread would expose it. It is worth pausing on why tissue is a better recorder than water, because this is the methodological insight that makes the whole study possible. If you go out and measure the nitrogen concentration in a sample of seawater, you get a number describing that specific parcel of water at that specific moment. Ocean chemistry is turbulent and patchy, and it changes with the season, the depth, the weather, and the time of day. To characterize a basin that way, you would need an impossible number of samples, taken continuously for decades, and nobody has that. The organism, on the other hand, integrates. It has been sitting in that water for weeks, absorbing what was available, and its tissue is a running average of everything it encountered. One sample of seaweed carries more information about the nutrient environment than one sample of water does, because the seaweed has already done the averaging for you. And critically, tissue samples get preserved. Water samples from 1985 do not exist in any usable form. Dried algal tissue from 1985 collected by someone asking a completely different question, sitting in a collection somewhere, that can still be analysed with modern instruments today. That is the scientific luck this study ran on. Somebody in the 1980s did careful work for their own reasons and stored the material properly, and 40 years later it became the baseline for a question they could not have anticipated. Then they measured what the tissue was made of. 3 numbers came out and all 3 point the same direction. Tissue nitrogen content increased by 35% between the 2 eras. Tissue phosphorus content decreased by 44%, and the ratio between them, the nitrogen to phosphorus ratio, which is one of the fundamental descriptors of how a marine organism is nourished, rose by 111%. In the 80s it sat around 13-1. In the 2010s it sat around 28-1. That is not a small drift. That is an organism whose basic internal composition is no longer what it was, measured against itself in the same ocean across roughly 30 years. Now, a ratio moving does not tell you which term moved, so let us be careful about what those numbers actually say. Nitrogen went up. Phosphorus went down more, proportionally than nitrogen went up, which means the organism is now living in a world where nitrogen has become comparatively easy to get, and phosphorus has become comparatively hard, where the thing limiting its growth has changed identity. For most of the history of marine biology, the assumption about the open ocean was that nitrogen is the scarce one. Nitrogen limitation is the default state of most of the sea. What these numbers describe is a system tipping toward phosphorus limitation instead, which is a different regime with different rules. The rules matter because the 2 nutrients have completely different origin stories. Nitrogen has an atmospheric reservoir. There is an effectively unlimited supply of it in the air, and biology has evolved machinery for accessing it, and humans have built industrial machinery for the same purpose. If you need more nitrogen in a system, the planet has plenty and there are routes to get at it. Phosphorus has no atmospheric reservoir at all. There is no phosphorus gas. It comes from rock. It moves through water. It accumulates in sediment, and the only ways to get it into a surface ocean are to erode it off a continent and wash it down a river, or to lift it up from below where it has already sunk. So a system that has shifted from nitrogen limitation to phosphorus limitation has in a real sense become dependent on geology and circulation, rather than on chemistry and air, and that's a very different thing to try to manage. Remember that distinction. It is going to be the hinge of the argument that follows, because the next major paper on this subject makes phosphorus the star and treats the nitrogen as something the system manufactures for itself. The spatial pattern in the data is where the interpretation gets its teeth. The highest nitrogen content and the highest nitrogen isotope values showed up in coastal waters influenced by nitrogen-loaded terrestrial runoff. The lowest carbon to nitrogen and carbon to phosphorus ratios showed up in winter and spring, which is when river discharge peaks. Those 2 observations together are a fingerprint. If the extra nitrogen were coming from the ocean interior, you would not expect it to correlate with proximity to river outflows, and you would not expect it to peak with the river calendar. It does both. Isotopes deserve a sentence of explanation, because they are the closest thing this field has to a forensic tool. Nitrogen comes in more than one stable form, differing slightly in mass, and different sources carry different proportions of the heavier form. Nitrogen from sewage and manure tends to be isotopically distinguishable from nitrogen produced by industrial fertilizer synthesis, and both are distinguishable from nitrogen fixed out of the atmosphere by bacteria. Read the isotope signature in a tissue sample, and you're not just measuring how much nitrogen the organism got. You're getting a hint about where it came from. The interpretation the team drew was direct, and it was the interpretation that dominated public discussion of the belt for the next 4 years. Human nutrient loading has removed the constraint that had kept this organism in check for tens of millions of years. The proposed delivery system was rivers, the Amazon primarily feeding the equatorial Atlantic, the Mississippi feeding the Gulf, the Congo feeding the eastern side, and the proposed sources feeding those rivers were the ones you would expect. Synthetic fertilizer washed off agricultural land, untreated or partially treated sewage, industrial discharge, and nutrient release from deforestation, because clearing forest and disturbing soil liberates nitrogen that the intact system had been holding. There is a well-documented precedent for exactly this mechanism operating at a smaller scale, and it sits at the end of one of those 3 rivers. Every summer, nutrients carried down the Mississippi from the agricultural interior of North America produce a zone of oxygen-depleted water in the northern Gulf of Mexico large enough to be mapped and reported annually. The chain is not disputed there. Fertilizer goes on fields in the Midwest. Rain moves a fraction of it into ditches and streams. Streams feed the river feeds the Gulf, algae bloom on the delivered nitrogen, the algae die, decomposition consumes the oxygen, and fish either leave or suffocate. Nobody argues about whether that happens. It is measured, it is modelled, it has a budget line attached to it. So when a team proposes that the same basic process is operating on a larger river and a larger ocean and producing a larger organism, they are not proposing something exotic. They are proposing that a mechanism we already accept at the scale of a continental shelf also runs at the scale of a basin. That is a reasonable extrapolation. Whether it is a correct one is precisely what the next 4 years would call into question. The scale of the fertilizer change alone is enough to make the mechanism plausible. Global production of synthetic fertilizer has risen roughly tenfold over recent decades. That is not a marginal adjustment to a planetary nutrient budget. Humans now fix more nitrogen out of the atmosphere industrially than the entire natural terrestrial biosphere does biologically, and a large fraction of it does not stay on the fields it was spread on. The phrase that came out of this work and that got picked up everywhere was that increased nitrogen availability had converted a critical nursery habitat into the world's largest harmful algal bloom. It is a good line, and it captures something real. It also does something subtle that is worth noticing. It reframes the belt from a curiosity into an indictment. If this reading is correct, then the structure sitting in the Atlantic Ocean right now is a direct physical readout of agricultural and sanitation practice on 3 continents, expressed thousands of kilometres offshore and visible from space. It would be one of the most legible large-scale signals of human nutrient loading anywhere on Earth. That is a powerful story, and for most of the last 5 years it was the story. And then a different team looked at the same ocean and concluded that the rivers are not the main event at all. Part 8. The Ocean's Own Answer. In November of 2025, Nature Geoscience published a paper by Jung, Dupré, Foreman and colleagues with work associated with the Max Planck Institute for Chemistry. The title is a full argument in itself. Equatorial upwelling of phosphorus drives Atlantic nitrogen fixation, and sargassum blooms. Notice what is in that title and what is not. Upwelling is in it. Phosphorus is in it. Nitrogen fixation is in it. Rivers are not. Fertilizer is not. Land is not. The mechanism they describe runs almost entirely inside the ocean, and it is genuinely elegant, so let me walk it in order. Step 1. Along the equator, the trade winds and the rotation of the planet combine to drive persistent upwelling. Water is pushed away from the equator on both sides, and water from below rises to replace it. That rising water carries the nutrient load of the ocean interior with it, and the term the paper focuses on is phosphorus. Step 2. That upwelled water does not stay at the equator. It gets transported northward into the belt's territory and onward toward the Caribbean, carrying its phosphorus with it. Step 3. And here is where it becomes clever. The paper's key quantity is not simply phosphorus. It is what they call excess phosphorus. That means phosphorus present in the water beyond what the available nitrogen can pair with. Photosynthetic life needs both in a rough proportion, If you supply an excess of one, the surplus sits there unused unless something can supply the matching amount of the other. Step 4. Something can. Riding on the surface of the drifting sargassum, growing on the fronds and the bladders as epiphytes, are cyanobacteria, and some cyanobacteria can fix nitrogen. That is to say, they can take nitrogen gas straight out of the atmosphere, which is inert and useless to almost everything alive, and convert it into a biologically usable form. That trick deserves more respect than it usually gets, because it is genuinely one of the hardest things any organism does. The air around you is about 78% nitrogen. It is the most abundant thing in the atmosphere by a wide margin, and almost nothing alive can touch it, because the two nitrogen atoms in a nitrogen molecule are held together by a triple bond, one of the strongest chemical bonds in ordinary matter. Breaking it industrially takes high temperature, high pressure, and a catalyst, and the process that does it was one of the most consequential inventions of the 20th century. A handful of microbes do the same job at ocean temperature and ordinary pressure using an enzyme called nitrogenase. It is metabolically expensive, and it has a peculiar vulnerability. Nitrogenase is destroyed by oxygen. So organisms that fix nitrogen have to run the reaction while simultaneously keeping oxygen away from it, which is an awkward thing to arrange when you are a photosynthetic organism whose day job is producing oxygen. The ones that manage it are among the most important organisms in the ocean, because they are the gateway through which nitrogen enters marine life at all, and in this mechanism they are living on the seaweed. It is the reason nitrogen limitation is not absolute anywhere the right microbes can grow, and that arrangement is not accidental on either side. A nitrogen-fixing microbe floating freely in open water has a problem. It is expending enormous metabolic effort to make nitrogen, and it is doing so somewhere with very little of anything else. Attach yourself to a large floating alga, and several problems solve themselves at once. You have a substrate. You are guaranteed to stay in the sunlit layer. You are surrounded by an organism that is constantly leaking organic material, and you are sitting exactly where the phosphorus is arriving. The seaweed, for its part, gets a nitrogen factory bolted to its own surface. Neither one is doing the other a favour. Both are doing what works. But the combined system is far more capable than either component would be alone. And that is what makes the mechanism so hard to argue with. It explains how a bloom of this size can be sustained in water that, measured on its own, does not contain enough nitrogen to build it. The nitrogen is not in the water, it is in the air, and the belt has brought its own machinery for getting at it. So the picture assembles into a partnership. The ocean's interior supplies the phosphorus, lifted at the equator and carried north. The microbial community living on the algae supplies the nitrogen, manufactured out of thin air. And the seaweed, which is providing the microbes with a floating platform in the sunlit layer, takes the product. Neither partner has to wait for a river. The strength of the claim is in what it explains. The authors argue that changes in nitrogen fixation across the tropical Atlantic have been controlled primarily by multi-decadal and interannual variation in equatorial upwelling of excess phosphorus, and that this combination, the upwelled phosphorus plus the nitrogen fixation it enables, accounts for the majority of sargassum variability since 2011. The majority, not a contributing factor, the main term. And the paper does not leave the disagreement implicit. It explicitly argues against the hypothesis that attributes the blooms mainly to agricultural runoff and deforestation. So we now have two peer-reviewed explanations, published 4 years apart in two of the most selective journals in the field, and they are not variations on a theme. One says the nitrogen comes off the land and the belt is a pollution signal. The other says the phosphorus comes up from the ocean interior, the nitrogen comes out of the air, and the belt is a circulation signal that would be happening with or without us. Both cannot be the dominant term. I want to be fair to both, because it is easy to hear the second one as a debunking of the first, and that is not quite what it is. The tissue chemistry Lapointe's team measured is real. Nitrogen content in this organism did increase by 35%, and it did so most strongly in coastal water near river outflows, and it did peak with the discharge calendar. Nobody has overturned those measurements. What the 2025 paper challenges is the leap from that pattern to a global explanation. You can grant that river nitrogen matters enormously in the Gulf of Mexico and off the Florida coast, where the samples showing the strongest signal were taken, and still argue that in the middle of the tropical Atlantic, where most of the biomass actually is, a different mechanism dominates. That is the shape of the disagreement, and it is a more interesting shape than a straightforward contradiction. It is an argument about which part of an ocean you are describing, and about whether a signal measured near the coast can be extrapolated to a structure that spans a basin. It is also worth knowing what the official position is while the specialists argue, because it is more careful than either paper, and it tells you how unsettled this actually is. The United States Environmental Protection Agency maintains a public page on the origins and drivers of this belt, and it was last updated in February of this year. It states that scientists agree the belt is sustained by nutrients from ocean currents and from land-based sources, both, not one, and then it lists 7 proposed sources of the nitrogen and phosphorus that fuel it. Discharge from the Congo, the Amazon and the Mississippi rivers, upwelling off the coast of Africa, vertical mixing, equatorial upwelling, atmospheric deposition from Saharan dust, the burning of plant biomass in Central and Southern Africa, and nutrient loads from urbanized coastal areas. 7. 3 continents, 2 oceanic processes, 1 atmospheric delivery system, and a fire regime. 2 of those deserve a moment on their own because they are the least intuitive. Saharan dust crosses the Atlantic every year in enormous quantities, lifted off North Africa and carried west on the trade winds, the same dust that periodically turns Caribbean skies milky and suppresses hurricane formation. That dust carries iron and other nutrients, and it falls out over the ocean along the way. And the burning of vegetation across Central and Southern Africa lofts nutrient-bearing ash and aerosols into the same wind system. So some fraction of what this seaweed is built from arrived as smoke and desert dust, blown across an ocean and settled onto the water from the sky. The EPA's stated dominant theory is that no single source fuels the belt. Instead, different sources play local roles at different points as the biomass travels west across the tropical Atlantic, African upwelling and dust in the east, equatorial upwelling in the middle, the Amazon plume in the west, coastal loading in the Gulf, which is a genuinely humble position for an agency to publish. It amounts to saying it is being fed from several directions at once and we cannot yet rank them. There is also a difference in what each explanation implies about the future, and it is stark. If the terrestrial nutrient reading is right, the belt is, at least in principle, something we control. Change agricultural practice, treat sewage, slow deforestation, and the nitrogen supply falls, and eventually the bloom does too. Painful, expensive, slow, but a lever exists, and it is in our hands. If the equatorial upwelling reading is right, there is no lever. Nobody is going to turn off equatorial upwelling. The belt would be a feature of how this ocean circulates, and the only available response would be adaptation, better forecasting, better removal, better use of the material. 2 papers, 2 mechanisms, 2 completely different futures, and then, this year, a third group published something that reframes the entire argument by pointing out that both sides may have been asking a question with a hidden assumption buried inside it. The assumption was that the answer is a constant. Part 9. It started feeding itself. The paper is by Joe, Novi, Hay and colleagues, published in Nature Communications this year, Volume 17, Article 4600. Mark Hay of Georgia Tech is among the authors, and the work is also archived through the United Kingdom's National Oceanography Centre. The title is the thesis, Changing Drivers of the Great Atlantic Sargassum Belt from Physical Forcing to Ecological Control, from to. That preposition pair is the whole finding. The claim is not that the belt is driven by X rather than Y. The claim is that the belt has been driven by different things at different points in its life, and that the handover has already happened. They built a nonlinear model of the system and ran it against the observational record, and what came out was a sequence in 3 stages. The word nonlinear is doing quiet but important work in that sentence, so it is worth a moment. A linear model assumes that if you double an input, you roughly double the output, that the system responds in proportion to what you do to it. That assumption is convenient, and it is often approximately true, and it is the reason most environmental relationships get described as trends. Living systems frequently do not behave that way. They have feedbacks. Output loops back and becomes input. Small changes get amplified, large changes get absorbed, and the relationship between cause and effect stops being a straight line and starts being a shape with corners in it. If you model a bloom linearly, you'll look for a proportional external driver, because that is the only kind of answer a linear model can give you. You will find the input that best correlates with the output, and you will call it the cause. Both of the earlier explanations are, in that sense, searching for a proportional driver. More river nitrogen, more bloom, more upwelled phosphorus, more bloom. Build the model with feedbacks in it, and a different kind of answer becomes visible. The system can be its own input. Stage 1 is the trigger, and we have already met it. The bloom was initiated by a prolonged negative phase of the North Atlantic Oscillation. That is the latch being lifted, and their analysis is where the 2011 origin gets tied firmly to the 2009 and 2010 atmospheric anomaly rather than to anything happening on land. Stage 2 is the early engine, and this is physical forcing. In the first years of the belt's existence, growth was driven by winter mixed layer deepening in response to stronger winds. That phrase needs unpacking, and it is the same physics we walked through earlier, seen from a different angle. The mixed layer is the upper part of the ocean that wind and waves stir into a single well-blended body of water. Its thickness varies with the season, and with how hard the wind is blowing. In summer, with weak winds and strong surface heating, it is thin, a warm lid sitting on top of everything. In winter, with stronger winds and a cooling surface, the stirring reaches further down, and the mixed layer deepens, and when it deepens, it reaches into water that has nutrients in it, and it pulls them up into the sunlit layer where they can be used. So a winter with stronger winds is a winter with a deeper mixed layer, and a winter with a deeper mixed layer is a winter that stocks the surface ocean's pantry for the growing season that follows. In the belt's early years, that was the control. Wind set the mixing set the nutrients set the size of the bloom. Stage 3 is where it gets genuinely unsettling, and it is the reason this video exists. Over time, a second driver has been growing in importance, and it is not atmospheric at all. It is the recycling of nutrients within the mixed layer itself, carried out by the community of organisms living on and around the sargassum, and by the aging mats themselves. Here is the loop. A mat of sargassum grows and takes up nitrogen and phosphorus. Living on that mat is an entire community. Bacteria, epiphytic algae, invertebrates, everything that colonizes a floating structure in the open ocean. Those organisms process the material. Meanwhile, the mat itself ages. Older sargassum breaks down, and as it breaks down, it releases its nutrient load back into the surrounding water, and the surrounding water is full of new sargassum, which immediately takes those nutrients up. The nutrients never leave. They circulate inside the bloom. Under the older understanding, a bloom this size should be a leaky, expensive thing to maintain. Every ton of biomass locks up nitrogen and phosphorus, and when that biomass dies and sinks, the nutrients go down with it, and are lost from the surface until upwelling or mixing brings some fraction back. On that model, the bloom needs a continuous external supply just to stand still. What this paper argues is that the belt has, over 15 years, built an internal economy efficient enough that it no longer needs the external supply to the same degree. It captures its own losses. It has closed the loop. The evidence they point to is the part I keep returning to because it is the closest thing this story has to a decisive test, and the system passed it in a way that should not have been possible under the old assumptions. In 2023 and 2024, stratification of the upper ocean increased. Increased stratification means the layers separate more sharply. The warm lid gets more firmly established. Mixing across the boundary becomes harder, and that means less nutrient delivery from below into the sunlit layer. Under the physical forcing model, that is a starvation signal. Less mixing, less food, smaller bloom. The belt should have contracted in those years. It did not. The internal recycling offset it. The bloom had accumulated enough of a self-sustaining nutrient economy that the reduction in external supply did not matter the way it would have 5 years earlier. And then, in 2025, the belt set an all-time record. And in 2026, 2 individual regions set all-time records inside a bloom that the whole ocean's layering was supposedly working against. That is what it looks like when a system stops being pushed and starts running. Now I want to sit with what this means, because it is bigger than seaweed. For 15 years, the argument about this belt has been an argument about inputs. Is the nitrogen coming from farms or from the equator? Is it rivers or is it upwelling? Is it our fault or is it the ocean's own business? Every side of that argument shared an assumption so basic that nobody thought to state it, that there is a supply line and that finding the supply line explains the structure. This paper's answer is that the supply line mattered enormously at the beginning and matters progressively less every year because the thing at the end of the supply line has learned to keep what it is given, which resolves the contradiction between the two previous papers in an unexpected way. They might both have been right about different eras. Terrestrial nutrients and equatorial upwelling could both have been significant external inputs during the years each team studied, and both could be receding in importance now, not because the sources have changed, but because the belt's dependence on them has. The scientists were not disagreeing about a fact. They were photographing a moving object at different moments and arguing about its position. And there is one more consequence in this paper that I think is going to matter more over the next decade than anything else in this story. If a system is being pushed around by year-to-year atmospheric noise, it is close to unforecastable. Wind anomalies, oscillation phases, storm tracks, these are chaotic at the timescales you would need. But if a system is governed mainly by its own internal dynamics, by a nutrient economy that carries over from one year into the next, then it has memory. And a system with memory is a system you can predict. That is the paper's other conclusion, and the authors are direct about it. The blooms may be predictable. That single sentence changes what this belt is. For 15 years it has been a recurring surprise that arrives on beaches and has to be shoveled. If it can be forecast, it stops being a disaster and starts being a harvest. There is a harder implication in the same finding, though, and the coverage of this paper has mostly skipped past it. A system sustained by external forcing can be switched off by removing the forcing. That is what makes pollution problems tractable in principle. Stop putting the thing in, and eventually the thing stops. It is slow and expensive and politically miserable, but the logic is sound, and we have done it before, with acid rain, and with ozone-depleting chemicals, and with leaded fuel. A system sustained by internal recycling does not work that way. If the belt is now largely feeding itself, then even a complete and instantaneous fix to every river on 3 continents would not make it go away. You would be closing a tap on a system that has stopped depending on the tap, which means that the most consequential question about this structure may no longer be what caused it. It may be whether anything can end it, and whether it will end on its own, by some failure of the recycling loop nobody has modelled yet, or whether the Atlantic Ocean simply has a second sargassum population now, permanently, the way it has a Gulf Stream. Nobody knows. There is no published collapse scenario. A self-sustaining system can also fail abruptly if its loop is broken, by a pathogen, by a grazer, by a circulation change that scatters the mats faster than they can regroup. And none of those possibilities have been examined in any detail, because the field has spent its first 15 years trying to work out why the thing is there at all. Assuming, of course, that anyone can find a use for 38 million tons of seaweed with a problem in it that almost nobody talks about. Because there is something in this material that constrains nearly every plan anyone has for it. And to understand why that matters, you have to see what happens when the belt stops being a satellite image and comes ashore. Part 10. 48 hours. Everything we have talked about so far has been a satellite product. Tonnages, regions, currents, nutrient budgets, a structure observed from 400 miles up and described in units that nobody experiences directly. Now, let us put it on a beach. Out in the open Atlantic, this organism is a floating forest that has sheltered 100 species of fish for tens of millions of years. It is habitat. It is, by any reasonable ecological accounting, a good thing. Bring the identical material into water a metre deep, push it up against a shoreline, and within 2 days it becomes a public health incident. The transition is fast and it is chemical. Once sargassum strands, it begins a putrefaction cycle within 24 to 48 hours. The mat is no longer floating in oxygenated water with light on it. It is piled in a heap, mostly buried by its own bulk, and the interior of that heap goes anoxic, oxygen-free, very quickly. What decomposes organic material in the absence of oxygen is a different set of bacteria running a different chemistry, and their waste products are different. The two that matter here are hydrogen sulfide and ammonia. Ammonia, you know, it is the sharp, eye-watering smell of cleaning products, and at high concentrations it is an irritant to the eyes, the airways and the skin. Hydrogen sulfide is the more serious one, and it has an unpleasant property that makes it more dangerous than its reputation suggests. At low concentrations it smells strongly of rotten eggs, which is a useful warning. At higher concentrations it deadens the sense of smell rapidly, so the warning disappears exactly when the hazard increases. People stop smelling it and assume it has gone away. It is also heavier than air, which means it pools in low ground, in enclosed spaces, in the trough behind a berm of rotting weed. The reason hydrogen sulfide is dangerous rather than merely unpleasant comes down to what it does inside a cell. Every cell in your body generates energy through a chain of reactions in the mitochondria, and the last step in that chain hands electrons to oxygen. Hydrogen sulfide interferes with that final handoff. It binds to the enzyme responsible and stops it working, which means the cell can be sitting in perfectly oxygenated blood and still be unable to use any of it. If that sounds familiar, it is because cyanide works by attacking the same step. Hydrogen sulfide is, in this specific respect, chemically related in effect to one of the most notorious poisons in the world, which is not a fact that features prominently in tourism board communications. At the concentrations produced by decomposing seaweed on an open beach, nobody is being poisoned in the acute dramatic sense. Air moves, the gas disperses, and the exposure is intermittent. What people get instead is a chronic, low-level repeated dose, day after day in their houses and their workplaces and their schools, and the body's response to a chronic low-level interference with cellular respiration is exactly the cluster of symptoms that showed up in the medical records. Headaches, breathlessness, dizziness. The vague, hard-to-pin down, easy-to-dismiss complaints that a doctor might attribute to a dozen other things if they were not seeing hundreds of them at once from the same neighbourhoods. For most of the history of this seaweed, none of that mattered, because the quantities reaching shore were small enough to decompose without generating meaningful concentrations of anything. Change the quantity by orders of magnitude and you change the nature of the problem. The clearest documented case is the 2018 mass stranding in the French West Indies. Martinique and Guadeloupe both took heavy, sustained inundations that year, and because both are French overseas territories with a functioning public health system that records clinical presentations, we have something that is otherwise very hard to get: an actual count. Over an 8-month period, physicians in the two territories recorded more than 11,000 cases of acute sargassum-related toxicity. More than 8,000 of those were in Martinique. More than 3,300 were in Guadeloupe. 11,000 people presenting to doctors in 8 months because of seaweed. The clinical picture was published in the journal Clinical Toxicology, Volume 59, Issue 3. The reported symptoms were heart palpitations, shortness of breath, dizziness, vertigo, headache, and skin rashes. That is a mixture of respiratory, neurological, and dermatological effects, which is consistent with sustained exposure to low and moderate concentrations of hydrogen sulfide rather than an acute high-dose event. I want to be precise about what that means, because the word poisoning conjures something dramatic, and this was not that. Nobody was dropping in the street. What happened was that thousands of people who lived and worked near affected shorelines spent months breathing air that was chronically contaminated, and their bodies responded the way bodies respond to that, with headaches that would not resolve, with breathlessness climbing stairs, with dizziness, with a rash that kept coming back. It was not a disaster in the sense of an event. It was a degradation of an environment, sustained long enough to show up in the medical statistics of an entire population. The French government's response gives you a sense of how seriously it was taken. 10 million euros were committed, and the specifics of what that money was for are revealing. Equipment capable of removing stranded sargassum within 48 hours. That number is not arbitrary. It is the putrefaction window. The entire logistical strategy was built around the chemistry. Get the material off the beach before it starts producing gas, and the health problem largely does not happen. Monitoring of hydrogen sulfide concentrations on affected shorelines, because you cannot manage an exposure you're not measuring. Training for physicians, because most doctors in the Caribbean had not previously needed to recognize chronic low-level sulfide exposure in a patient presenting with headaches and palpitations. And the deployment of toxicology specialists to the affected areas. That is a public health mobilization for seaweed. And there is a detail buried in that response that tells you how the economics of this work. The 48-hour target is not just a health measure. It is the difference between a manageable operating cost and a compounding one, because material removed on day 1 is wet seaweed, and material removed on day 4 is a chemical remediation job with a hazard assessment attached, which means the entire response strategy for a phenomenon spanning an ocean comes down to logistics on a 2-day clock, repeated indefinitely, at every affected beach simultaneously. That is a resource problem before it is a science problem, and it explains why the response has been so uneven across the region. Territories with money and equipment can hit the window. Territories without either cannot, and their exposure is not a function of how much seaweed arrived, but of how quickly anyone could get it off the sand. Meanwhile, in the water, a second set of consequences was running. Thick surface mats block light. Everything living on the seafloor underneath a stranded raft, seagrass beds, corals, other algae, is suddenly in the dark, and photosynthetic organisms in the dark do not last long. Seagrass beds in particular are slow to recover, and are themselves nursery habitat, so the loss compounds. Then there is the oxygen problem, which is the same chemistry as the smell, but with a different victim. Decomposition consumes dissolved oxygen out of the water column. Where strandings are large and persistent, nearshore oxygen can fall far enough to create dead zones, water that is physically fine and chemically uninhabitable. Fish that can leave. Everything attached to the bottom that cannot leave dies. Seagrass deserves its own sentence here because it is the quiet casualty. Seagrass meadows are among the most productive habitats in the shallow tropics. They stabilize sediment, they feed turtles and manatees directly, and they act as nursery ground for a large number of reef and coastal fish. They are also slow-growing and slow to recover, so a meadow lost to months of shading does not simply grow back when the weed clears, which produces a compounding effect that nobody wanted. The sargassum arrives because of an excess of nutrients somewhere in the system. It shades out the seagrass. The seagrass was one of the things that had been absorbing nutrients and stabilizing the nearshore environment. Remove it, and the nearshore becomes more susceptible to the next round of whatever arrives, and there is the entanglement problem, which is the one that tends to stay with people. Sea turtles nest on beaches. They come ashore, they dig, they lay, they return to the water. A shoreline banked with a metre of sargassum can physically prevent a nesting female from reaching the sand at all. And when hatchlings emerge and make the run toward the water, which is already the most dangerous few minutes of their lives, a barrier of weed at the waterline can trap them short of the sea. There is an economic layer running underneath all of this that rarely makes the science coverage, and for the places involved it is the layer that hurts most immediately. A large share of the Caribbean economy is built on the proposition that the beach is pleasant. That proposition is not compatible with a metre-thick bank of rotting algae producing a smell that carries inland, and the effect on bookings is not subtle. Hotels have discounted. Some properties have closed sections for parts of the season, and this is a recurring annual event now, not a one-off, which means it is a permanent line item rather than a bad year. The fisheries take it from the other direction. Boats cannot always get out of harbours choked with weed, engines foul, nets clog, and the nearshore fish that a small boat fishery depends on are the ones most exposed to the oxygen crash. So the same event degrades the two industries that a small island economy is most likely to be built on simultaneously every year on a schedule, which brings the whole thing into a shape that is genuinely difficult to hold in your head. The same organism that has served as the primary open ocean nursery for juvenile sea turtles for 30 million years is now, in its overabundance, killing them on the beach. Nothing about the seaweed changed. The species is identical. The chemistry of the individual organism is identical. What changed is the quantity and the location, and those two variables alone were enough to flip a habitat into a hazard. That flip has a name in ecology, and it is worth knowing, because it describes a lot more than seaweed. Part 11. What you cannot do with it. The principle is called the paradox of enrichment, and it is one of those ideas that sounds counterintuitive until you have seen it work, at which point you start seeing it everywhere. The intuition most of us carry is that nutrients are good. More food means more life. More life means a healthier system, and a system with more resources should be more robust than one with fewer. That is roughly how we think about ecosystems, and it is roughly how we think about most things. The paradox is that beyond a certain point, adding resources to an ecological system does not stabilize it. It destabilizes it. Populations that were held in check by scarcity are released. They overshoot, they crash, and the oscillations get wilder rather than gentler. Species adapted to living carefully in a poor environment get outcompeted by species that can grow fast in a wealthy one. And the system, which looked more productive on paper, becomes less predictable and less resilient. The Great Atlantic Sargassum Belt may be the largest working demonstration of that principle currently available on this planet. The open tropical Atlantic was nutrient poor, and the organisms that lived there had spent tens of millions of years adapting to nutrient poverty. Sargassum was one of them. It was doing fine, it was stable, it was supporting an entire community. Relieve the scarcity, and the same organism that was a well-behaved resident becomes something that produces 38 million tons a year and buries islands. More food did not produce more of the same. It produced something different. Which brings us to the obvious question, and the one that a lot of very smart people are currently working on. If there are tens of millions of tons of fast-growing biomass arriving on a predictable schedule, is that actually a problem, or is it an unclaimed resource that we are currently paying to bury? The list of proposed uses is long, and it is genuinely promising on paper. Biofuel, because the material is carbohydrate heavy, and grows without land, without fresh water, and without fertilizer inputs from anyone. Biogas through anaerobic digestion, which is essentially harnessing the same decomposition that causes the problem, but doing it in a sealed tank and capturing the gas instead of breathing it. Compost and soil amendment, bioplastics, construction and insulation material, and the recovery of trace elements concentrated in the tissue, which some have described as a kind of biological mining. The anaerobic digestion route is worth explaining because of how neatly it inverts the problem. The reason stranded sargassum is a health hazard is that it decomposes without oxygen and produces gas. Anaerobic digestion is precisely that process, deliberately performed inside a sealed vessel. You're not preventing the decomposition. You're simply doing it somewhere you control and collecting the output instead of breathing it. The methane that comes off can be burned for power or heat. The solid residue, depending on its contamination profile, can potentially be used as a soil amendment. The exact same chemistry that makes this material dangerous on a beach makes it useful in a tank, and the only difference is a wall and a pipe. The scale is also worth trying to feel, because the numbers stop meaning anything after a while. 38 million tons is not a quantity anyone has intuition for. For comparison, it is in the general range of the annual harvest of a significant global crop. It arrives free, it requires no land, no irrigation, no fertilizer, and no planting, and it is currently, in most places, a cost centre. There is also the climate angle, which is the one that got the most attention when the predictability paper came out this year. Fast-growing macroalgae fix carbon. Some fraction of sargassum biomass sinks below the mixed layer and out of contact with the atmosphere, and if you could reliably harvest and sink the material, or harvest it and lock the carbon into something durable, you would have a carbon removal method that runs on sunlight and an ocean current. The press framing around the 2026 paper leaned hard into exactly that, from environmental crisis to climate opportunity. Now here is the part that most of that coverage does not lead with. In 2023, a study published in Nature Communications examined the nutrient and arsenic biogeochemistry of pelagic sargassum in the Western Atlantic. The finding is simple and it is a serious constraint. This seaweed concentrates arsenic in its tissue. Arsenic occurs naturally in seawater at low concentrations, and various marine organisms take it up and accumulate it. Brown algae are known to be particularly good at this, so the material coming ashore is not simply plant matter. It is plant matter carrying a toxic metalloid at concentrations that have to be measured before you can decide what to do with it, and that measurement determines everything downstream. If you want to compost it and put it on agricultural soil, arsenic content is the question that decides whether you can. If you want to feed it to livestock, the same. If you want to process it into anything that will touch food, the same. Several of the most attractive and most immediately available uses for this material, the ones that could be adopted by a small island with limited capital right now using existing equipment, are precisely the ones that arsenic makes complicated. Which produces a bleak little irony. The uses that are hardest to rule out on contamination grounds are the industrial ones, fuel, gas, materials. Those require capital, infrastructure, and a reliable supply chain, and the places receiving the most sargassum are frequently small island economies that have the supply and not the capital. So the material arrives, in enormous quantity, at exactly the locations least equipped to convert it into anything, and the most straightforward conversions are the ones most constrained by its chemistry. As of right now, in August of 2026, nothing is operating at meaningful scale. There is research, there are pilot projects, there are patents and proposals and startups. There is no industry. 38 million tonnes a year of a forecastable satellite-tracked freely available biological resource is currently in the main a disposal cost. There is one more approach that deserves a mention, because it sidesteps the whole beach problem, and it becomes plausible only because of the predictability finding: harvest it offshore. If you can forecast where the biomass will be and when, you could in principle intercept it at sea before it strands. That solves the health problem, the tourism problem, and the ecosystem problem simultaneously, because the material never reaches the coast. It also solves the sand problem, because you are not scraping a beach, and the material you collect offshore is cleaner than the material you collect from a beach, which comes mixed with sand, debris, and whatever else was on the shoreline. The obstacles are not scientific. They are that nobody has built the vessels, nobody has established who owns seaweed floating in international water, nobody has determined what the environmental consequences of removing a habitat at scale would be. Remember, this stuff is a nursery, and 100 fish species and 145 invertebrate species live in it, and nobody has committed the money. That last cluster of problems is why the harvest question is really a governance question, and governance questions do not get solved by satellites. Consider the ownership problem on its own for a moment, because it is stranger than it first appears. A mat of sargassum forms in international water off the coast of one continent, feeding on nutrients that may have originated on a second continent, delivered by a current that touches a dozen national jurisdictions, before stranding on the beach of a small island nation that had no involvement in any part of the process except receiving it. Who owns that? Who is responsible for it? Who pays to remove it? And if it turns out to be worth something, who gets the money? There is no established answer to any of those questions, because until 15 years ago there was nothing to answer them about, and there is a genuine ecological objection to large-scale harvest that has to be taken seriously rather than waved away. We spent the first half of this video establishing that these mats are habitat: 100 fish species, 145 invertebrate species, juvenile turtles, an entire floating community with obligate residents that cannot live anywhere else. Industrial-scale removal of floating sargassum from the open Atlantic would be the removal of a habitat, and nobody has done the work to establish at what point that removal stops being a cleanup and starts being a different kind of damage. The material is simultaneously a public health hazard, a potential resource, and a nursery. All three are true. Any policy that treats it as only one of those will get the other two wrong. We have watched this pattern before on this channel. In our video from July 24th, on the two ocean basins behaving in opposite ways, the science was clear and the response was fragmented, because the science crossed jurisdictions and the response did not. Same shape here. The belt spans an ocean, touches dozens of nations, and is understood by a research community that has no authority to act on any of it. Which leaves us with the strangest part of this whole story, and the reason it attracts the kind of explanations it attracts. Part 12. The wrong answers and the real one. Whenever something enormous appears with no obvious cause, and the experts publicly disagree about what caused it, a vacuum opens. Something is going to fill that vacuum, and it is generally not going to be a careful reading of the literature. So let us take the alternative explanations seriously, one at a time, because a couple of them are more reasonable than they sound, and all of them tell you something about how people react to a mystery. The first is that somebody made this happen deliberately. This claim usually attaches to ocean fertilization, the idea that if you add nutrients to a patch of ocean, you can trigger a bloom, and if you can trigger a bloom, you can generate carbon credits, and where there are credits, there is money and therefore motive. The idea is not fictional. Ocean fertilization experiments have genuinely been conducted, mostly involving iron added to nutrient-limited waters, and the results were interesting enough to publish, and disappointing enough that most of the field moved on. There has also been at least one privately funded dumping operation that generated a considerable amount of controversy. But the arithmetic does not survive contact with the belt. Those experiments operated over patches of ocean measured in tens or hundreds of square kilometres. The belt spans an ocean basin. To fertilize it deliberately, you would need a nutrient delivery operation running for years at industrial scale across international waters, involving hundreds of vessels, and nobody would notice. More decisively, the timing is anchored to a documented atmospheric anomaly, and the origin is anchored to a specific region north of the Amazon mouth. both of which were reconstructed from imagery collected before anyone was looking for them. You cannot retroactively plant that evidence. The second claim is that the organism itself is engineered, that this is not natural sargassum, but something built or modified. The answer here is straightforward. The belt population is Sargassum natans and Sargassum fluitans, the same two species catalogued from the Sargasso Sea for centuries, with fossil relatives in this ocean going back roughly 30 million years. There is no novel organism. There is a native organism in a new place at an unprecedented quantity, which is a much stranger fact than a laboratory would be. The third claim is that the true size is being concealed. This one is worth addressing because it inverts so completely on inspection. The tonnage figures come from a publicly funded university laboratory that publishes them free every month with named contacts and an email address, complete with a disclaimer warning people not to overinterpret the product. The record-breaking numbers are announced, not buried. If there is an anomaly in how this information flows, it is that a laboratory can publish a measurement describing the largest bloom of its kind ever recorded and have most of the world not hear about it. The suppression is not happening at the source, it is happening at the level of attention. And that is worth dwelling on for a second, because it is the real version of the thing the conspiracy is reaching for. Something genuinely is being missed here. Not hidden, missed. The largest bloom of its kind ever recorded on this planet has been setting records for 2 consecutive years, and outside the affected coastlines and a fairly small research community, most people have never heard of it. There is no cover-up. There is a measurement, published monthly in public, that almost nobody reads. The instinct that says something this big could not simply be overlooked is a reasonable instinct. It is also demonstrably wrong. Things this big get overlooked constantly. That is not a conspiracy. That is what an information environment optimized for novelty does with a slow, recurring, geographically distant phenomenon that does not photograph dramatically. A structure 8,000 kilometers across gets less attention than most weather events, because it does not have a landfall date and it does not have a name. The fourth is the oldest, and it is the one I have the most affection for because it is genuinely 500 years old. The Sargasso Sea has been considered eerie since Columbus's crews sailed into the weed in 1492 and feared they would be caught in it, and the region's reputation later merged into the mythology of the Bermuda Triangle. The mats cannot trap a vessel. They are thin, discontinuous surface rafts that part around a hull. But the fear was real and it was recorded, and there is something worth respecting in the fact that the first human reaction to this organism, before anyone knew what it was to assume it was dangerous in a way it was not, while missing entirely the way it eventually would be. They were wrong about the mechanism and right about the unease. That is the pattern worth noticing across all of these. Every one of these alternative explanations is reaching for something real. The engineering claim is reaching for the fact that human activity genuinely has altered the planet's nutrient cycles at global scale. The suppression claim is reaching for the fact that something enormous genuinely is going largely unnoticed. The lab origin claim is reaching for the fact that this organism genuinely is doing something it has never done before. And the 500-year-old sailor's fear was reaching for the fact that this part of the ocean genuinely does not behave like the rest of it. The instincts are sound. The mechanisms are wrong. And in almost every case, the true explanation is more interesting than the invented one, which is the part that keeps surprising me. The fifth claim is the one that actually deserves engagement, that the scientists do not know and are therefore making it up. They do not know. That part is correct. What follows from it is not. 3 research groups published 3 different conclusions in 5 years because they use different methods on different data over different windows of time, and because the question is hard and the phenomena is 15 years old. That is not what fabrication looks like. That is what an open question looks like while it is being closed. And the most recent paper's central claim is that the answer legitimately changed because the system changed, which, if it holds, means all 3 groups were describing something real at the moment they measured it. The uncertainty here is not a failure of the science. It is the science arriving in real time at something that is still moving. And that finally is the thing I want to leave you with, because it is stranger than any of the alternatives. We are used to the idea that the planet changes slowly. Continents drift at the speed of fingernails. Species evolve over millions of years. Ice sheets take millennia. The whole intuition of Earth science is that the big things move imperceptibly and that the human timescale is too short to watch them. This one did not. A floating organism sat in one gyre for 30 million years, through the closing of the isthmus that separated two oceans, through the growth of the polar ice, through every ice age in the record. A wind pattern shifted for a couple of seasons. The organism relocated. It found food. It doubled every 11 days until it spanned an ocean. And then, over about 15 years, it built an internal economy efficient enough that it no longer needs whatever fed it in the first place. The belt changed masters. The thing that started it is not the thing that keeps it running, and it now recycles enough of its own material that even the ocean's layering working against it in 2023 and 2024 could not shrink it. Which means that when we finally settle the argument about what causes the Great Atlantic Sargassum Belt, the answer may already be historical. We will have worked out what switched it on, at roughly the moment when what switched it on stopped mattering. And it raises a question about everything else we think is stable. If a floating organism can be relocated across an ocean basin by a 2-year wind anomaly and establish a permanent second population, then the stability we assume in large biological systems may be less about those systems being robust and more about nothing having pushed them lately. The Sargasso Sea arrangement lasted 30 million years not necessarily because it was unbreakable, but possibly because nothing had happened to break it. We tend to read longevity as evidence of strength. Sometimes longevity is just evidence of a quiet neighbourhood. There is a version of this planet not far from the one you are standing on, where nobody had a satellite pointed at the tropical Atlantic in 2011, and this entire structure assembled itself unobserved, and the first anyone knew of it was the beaches. We got lucky. We were watching. But watching is not the same as understanding, and we are running out of time to do the second one before the system moves again. The next test is close, and it is a number. The lab in Florida publishes its bulletin every month. Last year in May, this thing hit an all-time record of roughly 38 million tons. This June, 2 individual regions set all-time highs, while the belt as a whole came in just barely second. The people who produced those numbers wrote, at the end of May, that 2026 might yet become a record year by the summer. We are in the summer, the bulletins are still coming, and the only question that matters right now is whether the largest living structure ever measured on this planet is about to break its own record again, or whether something out there has finally started pushing back.